The Greyhound bus coughed and wheezed its final breaths as it pulled into the dusty depot of Havenwood, a town whose name felt increasingly ironic to Sergeant Michael O'Connell. He'd last seen this place as a vibrant tapestry of familiar faces and comforting routines, a haven indeed. Now, 5 years and a lifetime of experiences later, he stepped onto the cracked pavement with a body riddled with shrapnel and a spirit scarred by loss. His left leg, encased in a bulky brace, protested with every movement, a constant, dull throb that echoed the deeper ache in his soul. The war had taken more than just his mobility. It had stolen a piece of his identity, leaving him a stranger in the land he once called home. He'd pictured this moment 1,000 times during those long, sleepless nights in the desert, clinging to the hope of a warm embrace from his mother, a hearty handshake from his best friend, the comforting normalcy of his old life. The reality, however, felt starkly different as he scanned the small crowd waiting to disembark. His mother wasn't there. His best friend, Jimmy, had moved out of state years ago. The faces were mostly unfamiliar. A new generation that had grown up in his absence, their lives untouched by the horrors he had witnessed. Michael hefted his worn duffel bag, the weight of it feeling insignificant compared to the emotional baggage he carried. Each step was a conscious effort, the uneven pavement a stark reminder of his limitations. He made his way slowly towards the taxi stand, the afternoon sun beating down on his face, amplifying the weariness that clung to him like a second skin. He gave the taxi driver his mother's address, the familiar numbers a bittersweet melody in his mind. The drive through Havenwood was a blur of half-remembered landmarks and unfamiliar storefronts. The town had changed, or perhaps it was he who had changed too much to recognize it. The vibrant energy he remembered seemed to have been replaced by a quiet, almost indifferent hum. His mother, bless her heart, greeted him with the overflowing joy he had desperately hoped for. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged him tightly, the scent of her familiar perfume a momentary balm to his wounded soul. For those first few days, cocooned in the warmth of his childhood home, surrounded by familiar photographs and the comforting routines of his mother's care, Michael almost managed to convince himself that he could piece his old life back together. But the world outside the familiar walls of his home soon began to intrude. Simple trips to the grocery store became exercises in endurance, not just physical, but emotional. The curious stares, the hushed whispers, the well-intentioned but often clumsy questions about his time in the service. They all served as constant reminders of his altered state. He was no longer just Michael, the star quarterback of Havenwood High. He was Michael, the wounded soldier, the one who had come back. Different. Old acquaintances, once eager to slap him on the back and share a beer, now seemed hesitant, unsure how to interact with the man who carried the visible scars of war. Their conversations felt stilted, filled with awkward silences and forced cheerfulness. He could see the pity in their eyes, a sentiment he loathed more than any enemy he had faced on the battlefield. He didn't want pity. He wanted understanding, acceptance, a return to the camaraderie they once shared. The weight of this unspoken separation began to settle upon him, heavier than any physical burden. He found himself retreating more and more into the solitude of his home, the once comforting silence now amplifying his feelings of isolation. The hope that had sustained him through the darkest days of war began to dwindle, replaced by a gnawing sense of disappointment and a growing resentment towards a world that seemed to have moved on without him. A world where he no longer quite fit. The haven he had longed for felt increasingly like a gilded cage, trapping him with the ghosts of his past and the stark reality of his present. The initial joy of returning home was slowly being eroded by the insidious corrosion of unspoken judgment and a growing sense of being utterly alone. The whispers started subtly, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind, almost imperceptible at first. But Michael, his senses honed by years of vigilance in hostile territory, picked them up. He heard the hushed tones in the grocery store aisle as he reached for a jar of his mother's favorite pickles. He noticed the way the young cashier's smile faltered as she scanned his groceries, her eyes flicking down to his braced leg and then quickly away, filled with an awkward pity he found suffocating. In the local diner, a place he used to frequent with Jimmy after Friday night football games, the atmosphere seemed to shift when he walked in. Conversations would abruptly cease, replaced by an uncomfortable silence punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. Old classmates, their faces now lined with the responsibilities of early adulthood, would nod curtly and then quickly turn back to their meals, avoiding eye contact as if afraid of catching something contagious. The questions, when they came, were often well-meaning, but laced with an underlying curiosity that felt intrusive. "So, Michael, how's the leg?" someone would ask, their tone hesitant, as if the word wound was too graphic to utter in polite company. Or, "Did you see a lot of action over there?" a neighbor would inquire, their eyes wide with a morbid fascination, as if his experiences were a form of entertainment for their quiet suburban lives. He tried to be gracious, to offer brief, neutral answers, but each interaction chipped away at his already fragile sense of normalcy. He didn't want to be defined by his injury, by the things he had seen and done. He wanted to be Michael O'Connell again, the guy who could throw a perfect spiral and who always had a joke ready. But the war had irrevocably altered that identity, leaving him feeling like a faded photograph of his former self. The isolation grew deeper with each passing day. His old friends, once his constant companions, now had wives, families, careers that filled their time. Their invitations became less frequent, their excuses for not hanging out more elaborate. He understood, in a way. Their lives had continued while his had been put on hold, violently interrupted by the harsh realities of combat. He was a stranger in their world now, someone who carried the weight of experiences they couldn't possibly comprehend. It was at the local bar, a place he had always found a sense of camaraderie and belonging, that the whispers took a darker turn. He had gone there hoping for a sense of familiarity, a chance to reconnect with some of the guys he used to know. But the atmosphere felt different. There were new faces, younger men who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like disdain. He overheard snatches of conversations, muttered under breaths as he walked by. "Look at the cripple." Another one come back looking for a handout. The words, sharp and cruel, hit him like a physical blow. He turned, ready to confront the speaker, but the faces around him were blank, innocent. He couldn't be sure who had said it, and the uncertainty only amplified his sense of vulnerability. He nursed his beer slowly, the familiar taste offering little comfort. The laughter and boisterous conversations around him felt alien, belonging to a world he no longer inhabited. He was an outsider here now, marked by his scars, a constant reminder of a conflict they had only seen on the news. The camaraderie he had hoped for was replaced by a cold, isolating indifference. He finished his drink quickly, the bitter taste lingering in his mouth, and left, the whispers seeming to follow him out the door and into the quiet night. The haven of Havenwood was beginning to feel like a hostile territory all its own. The whispers morphed into more tangible forms of stigma as weeks turned into months. Michael's efforts to reintegrate into his old life met with a wall of unspoken judgment and awkward pity that felt more isolating than the deserts of Afghanistan. Job applications, once submitted with a hopeful heart, came back with polite but firm rejections. The reasons were never explicitly stated, but he could read between the lines. The company needed someone reliable, someone strong, someone whole. His war wounds, though healing physically, seemed to disqualify him in the eyes of potential employers, marking him as damaged goods in a world that valued productivity and flawless efficiency. Even casual interactions took on a new, uncomfortable dynamic. When he walked into Miller's hardware store, a place where he had worked summers during high school, Mr. Miller, his old boss, greeted him with a forced enthusiasm that didn't quite reach his eyes. The usual banter about local gossip and upcoming football games was absent, replaced by hesitant inquiries about his disability benefits and well-meaning but patronizing advice about taking it easy. Michael felt a burning resentment rise within him. He didn't want handouts or pity. He wanted a chance to prove that his wounds didn't define him, that he was still capable and willing to work hard. Children, unburdened by the social niceties of adulthood, were often the most direct. They would point and stare at his leg brace, their innocent curiosity sometimes laced with a hint of fear. Their parents would quickly hush them and steer them away, as if his injuries were something shameful to behold. Michael understood their reaction, but it still stung. Another constant reminder of his physical difference. The social landscape of Havenwood, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like a minefield of potential awkward encounters and unspoken judgments. He found himself avoiding places he used to enjoy: the local diner, the town park, even the Friday night football games under the lights that had once been the highlight of his week. The joy had been replaced by a crushing self-consciousness, a feeling that he was a spectacle, a living monument to a war that most people preferred to forget. His mother, bless her heart, tried her best to shield him from the negativity, but even her unwavering love couldn't completely insulate him from the subtle but persistent ostracization. He overheard her hushed conversations on the phone with old friends, her voice filled with a defensive pride as she spoke of his service and the sacrifices he had made. He knew she was hurting too, witnessing her strong, vibrant son struggling to find his place in the world he had returned to defend. The whispers eventually took a more insidious turn, fueled by ignorance and fear. Rumors began to circulate about the real extent of his injuries, whispers of shell shock and emotional instability painting him as not just physically wounded, but mentally fragile and potentially dangerous. These rumors, though baseless and cruel, began to take root in the minds of some residents, creating an invisible barrier of fear and suspicion around him. He could feel their wary glances, the subtle shift in their body language when he approached, a palpable sense of unease that made him feel like a pariah in his own hometown. The haven he had longed for was slowly transforming into a prison of prejudice. Each day, a fresh reminder of the chasm that had grown between him and the world he once knew. The weight of being an outsider pressed down on Michael with an almost physical force. The simple act of walking down Main Street, once a source of casual greetings and friendly banter, now felt like navigating a gauntlet of averted gazes and hushed whispers. He could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere as he approached, the conversations dying down, the smiles fading. It was as if his presence cast a shadow over the otherwise bright and cheerful facade of Havenwood. His attempts to reconnect with old hobbies also proved to be sources of further disappointment. He tried to rejoin the local softball team, a pastime he had once loved. But the captain, a guy he'd known since kindergarten, politely but firmly suggested that perhaps he wasn't quite up to it anymore. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. His injured leg was a liability, a weakness that wouldn't fit in with the team's competitive spirit. The rejection stung, another reminder of the ways in which the war had diminished him in the eyes of his peers. Even the solitude of the woods, a place he had always found peace and solace, now offered little comfort. The physical challenges of navigating the uneven terrain with his braced leg served as a constant reminder of his limitations. The freedom and agility he once felt in the wilderness had been replaced by a frustrating struggle, each step a painful acknowledgement of what he had lost. The four walls of his childhood home became his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the judging eyes and the whispered rumors. But even there, the silence often felt deafening, amplifying the gnawing loneliness that had become his constant companion. He spent hours staring out the window, watching the world go by, feeling like a ghost trapped in a life that no longer belonged to him. His mother did her best to keep his spirits up, but he could see the worry etched on her face, the silent concern in her eyes. He knew he was a burden, a constant source of anxiety for her, and that knowledge only added to his sense of guilt and isolation. Sleep offered little respite from the emotional turmoil. His nights were often filled with vivid flashbacks of the war, the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoing in the darkness, the faces of fallen comrades haunting his dreams. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the lingering fear making it difficult to distinguish between the horrors of the past and the bleakness of his present reality. As the days bled into weeks, Michael found himself sinking deeper into a pit of despair. The hope of a triumphant return had been replaced by a crushing sense of failure. He had gone to war to serve his country, to protect the freedoms of his community, and yet, upon his return, he was treated like an outcast, a broken reminder of a conflict they would rather forget. The haven he had yearned for had become a hostile landscape, filled with unspoken judgments and the isolating sting of pity. He felt lost, adrift in a world that no longer seemed to have a place for him, a wounded warrior abandoned by the very people he had fought to defend. Their drive-by insults soon escalated into more direct confrontations. They would loiter near the town's small memorial park, a place Michael occasionally visited to reflect and find some semblance of peace. As he approached, they would gather, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of mockery and challenge. Their leader, a hulking young man named Jake, who had always harbored a sense of jealousy towards Michael's past athletic achievements, was particularly vocal in his torment. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Jake would sneer, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "The war hero. Still dragging that leg around, are we?" His cronies would laugh, their eyes mirroring Jake's contempt. Michael tried to ignore them, to keep his head held high and walk past with as much dignity as he could muster. But their taunts would follow him, their words like stones pelting his already battered spirit. "What's wrong, O'Connell? Cat got your tongue? Or did the war take that too?" One afternoon, as Michael was sitting on a bench in the park, lost in thought, Jake and his friends approached him directly. They surrounded him, their presence menacing. Jake stood directly in front of him, his shadow falling over Michael, blocking the weak afternoon sun. "You know, O'Connell," Jake said, his voice low and threatening, "this town used to be a decent place. Now we got guys like you walking around, making everyone uncomfortable." Michael looked up at him, his eyes filled with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Jake chuckled humorlessly. "Just your very existence bothers us, cripple. You're a reminder of things we don't want to think about." Another of Jake's friends, a wiry young man named Billy, stepped closer and gestured mockingly at Michael's leg brace. "Yeah, go back where you came from, hero. Nobody wants your kind here." The injustice of their words, the sheer cruelty of their blatant disrespect, finally ignited a spark of anger within Michael. He had fought for their right to live in peace, and this was the gratitude he received. But the years of military discipline, the ingrained instinct to avoid unnecessary conflict, held him back from reacting physically. He simply stood up slowly, his injured leg protesting with a sharp stab of pain, and tried to walk away. But Jake wasn't finished. He reached out and shoved Michael roughly, sending him stumbling. Michael caught himself before he fell, his hand gripping the back of the bench for support. The shock and humiliation washed over him, the casual violence a stark reminder of his current physical vulnerability. Their laughter followed him as he limped away, the faces of his tormentors etched into his memory, their cruel words echoing in his ears. The haven of Havenwood had now revealed its ugliest side, and Michael found himself facing a new enemy, one that wore the familiar faces of his hometown. The casual shove in the park, while humiliating, was just the beginning of Jake and his crew's emboldened harassment. They seemed to take pleasure in his quiet suffering, interpreting his attempts to avoid confrontation as weakness. Their taunts became more frequent, more personal, and more malicious, poisoning the already fragile atmosphere of Michael's return. One afternoon, Michael decided to visit the town's small cemetery. It was a peaceful place, nestled on a hill overlooking Havenwood, and he often found a measure of solace there, among the quiet rows of headstones. He went to pay his respects to his father, who had passed away while Michael was overseas. His father had always been his biggest supporter, a quiet, strong man who had instilled in Michael a sense of duty and resilience. Standing before his father's grave, Michael felt a renewed sense of loss, a longing for the guidance and strength his father had always provided. As he turned to leave the cemetery, he saw Jake and his friends loitering near the entrance, leaning against the stone wall that marked the boundary of the grounds. A wave of apprehension washed over Michael, but he tried to ignore them and walk past, his head bowed in respect for the solemnity of the place. "Look who it is," Jake called out, his voice echoing through the quiet cemetery. "Visiting your old man? Probably complaining about how useless you are now." Michael stopped, his fists clenching. He tried to swallow the anger that surged within him, reminding himself to stay calm, to avoid any unnecessary confrontation. He took a deep breath and continued walking, hoping they would simply let him pass. But Jake and his friends blocked his path. They spread out, forming a semicircle around him, their expressions menacing. Jake stepped closer, his eyes filled with a cruel satisfaction. "You know, O'Connell," he sneered, his voice low and condescending, "this town ain't big enough for heroes who come back broken. You're just a reminder of failure." Billy, ever eager to please Jake, stepped forward and pointed at Michael's leg brace. "Yeah, why don't you just crawl back under the rock you came from?" The disrespect towards his father, the callous disregard for his sacrifice, and the blatant cruelty of their words finally pushed Michael past his breaking point. The years of suppressed anger and frustration erupted within him. He was tired of being the target, tired of the pity, tired of the whispers and the judgment. He had endured enough. Without a word, Michael lunged forward, his good leg providing surprising power. He aimed a swift kick at Billy's leg, catching him off guard and sending him sprawling to the ground with a yelp of pain. Before Jake and the others could react, Michael spun around and delivered a sharp elbow strike to the face of another of Jake's friends, who stumbled backward, clutching his nose. Jake, momentarily stunned by Michael's sudden and unexpected aggression, quickly recovered and charged forward, swinging a wild punch. Michael, despite his injury, still possessed the reflexes and training of a soldier. He sidestepped the clumsy blow and used Jake's momentum against him, executing a swift takedown maneuver he had learned in basic training. In a matter of seconds, Jake found himself on the ground, pinned beneath Michael's weight, his face contorted in shock and anger. "Get off me, you cripple!" Jake roared, struggling to break free. Michael's grip tightened. His eyes, usually filled with a quiet weariness, now burned with a cold fury. "Don't you ever disrespect my father again," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "And don't you ever call me that again." He held Jake pinned for a long, tense moment. The silence of the cemetery broken only by their ragged breathing and the whimpering of Billy and his other injured friend. Then, with a final surge of anger, Michael shoved Jake away and stood up, his body trembling with adrenaline. He looked down at the stunned and injured youths, his expression a mixture of rage and a bitter sense of satisfaction. He had finally fought back, but the act had left him feeling more drained and conflicted than victorious. He knew this confrontation would have consequences, but in that moment, all he felt was a raw, burning need for retribution, a desperate desire to make them pay for the torment they had inflicted upon him. The immediate aftermath of the cemetery brawl left Michael physically shaken and emotionally exhausted. The raw anger that had fueled his brief outburst quickly subsided, replaced by a familiar wave of weariness and a nagging sense of unease. He knew that his actions would likely escalate the situation. But in that moment, the need to defend his father's honor and his own battered dignity had overridden any rational thought. As he limped back home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Havenwood, his mind drifted back to his time in the service. The stark contrast between the camaraderie he had experienced with his fellow soldiers and the cold isolation he now felt in his hometown was a bitter pill to swallow. He remembered the grueling days of training, the shared hardships, and the unwavering support they had offered each other as they pushed their bodies and minds to their limits. He recalled the tense moments before a mission, the unspoken understanding that passed between them, the shared fear and the unwavering courage they found in each other's presence. Faces flashed through his mind. Sergeant Major Davies, a grizzled veteran who had instilled in him the importance of discipline and resilience. Corporal Miller, his quick-witted and ever-optimistic bunkmate who could always find a reason to smile, even in the darkest of times. Private Rodriguez, a young kid fresh out of boot camp who had looked up to Michael with an almost hero-worshipping gaze. They had been more than just fellow soldiers. They had been his brothers, bound together by the shared crucible of war. They had laughed together, cried together, and bled together. They had trusted each other with their lives, relying on each other's skills and unwavering loyalty in the face of unimaginable danger. There had been no room for judgment or prejudice in their ranks. They were a unit, a team. Their survival dependent on their ability to look beyond superficial differences and embrace their shared humanity. He remembered the countless nights spent huddled together in the cramped confines of their barracks, sharing stories of home, dreams of the future, and the quiet anxieties that gnawed at their insides. They had celebrated birthdays with makeshift cakes and cheap beer, mourned losses with silent nods and shared glances, and always had each other's backs. The bond they had forged in the heat of battle was stronger than any blood tie, a deep and abiding connection that transcended geographical distance and the passage of time. Now, surrounded by the familiar yet alien landscape of his hometown, Michael felt a profound sense of loss for that camaraderie, for that feeling of belonging. The people of Havenwood saw him as damaged, different, an outsider. His fellow soldiers had seen him as one of their own, a brother in arms who had faced the same trials and tribulations. They had understood the sacrifices he had made, the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. The memory of their unwavering support brought a flicker of warmth to the cold emptiness that had settled in Michael's heart. He realized that he wasn't entirely alone. Somewhere out there, scattered across the country, were the men who had shared his experiences, who understood what he had been through without the need for explanation. The thought sparked a faint ember of hope within him, a fragile reminder that there were still people in the world who truly cared, who wouldn't judge him for his wounds, who would stand by him no matter what. The ember of hope that had been kindled by the memory of his comrades began to glow a little brighter. Michael knew he couldn't continue to wallow in self-pity and isolation. If the people of Havenwood had turned their backs on him, Perhaps his true belonging lay with the men who had shared his battles. He started with Sergeant Major Davies. He remembered Davies as a man of unwavering resolve and extensive connections within the military community. If anyone could offer guidance or support, it would be him. Finding Davies' contact information proved to be a challenge. He started with old deployment rosters and unit directories he had stored away in a box in the attic. The paper was yellowed and brittle. The ink faded in places. But as he carefully scanned the lists, familiar names jumped out at him, each one a reminder of shared experiences and unbreakable bonds. Davies' last known address was a small town in Montana, a place Michael had only heard him mention in passing during late-night conversations under the desert stars. He tried searching online, using every variation of Davies' name and rank he could think of. But the results were frustratingly generic. There were many Davies who had served in the military, but none that matched the man he remembered. Undeterred, Michael decided to try reaching out to Corporal Miller. Miller had been more active on social media before their last deployment, often posting lighthearted updates and sharing photos of their unit. Michael hadn't checked Miller's profile since returning home, hesitant to face the ghosts of their shared past. But now, driven by a sense of desperation and a sliver of renewed hope, he navigated to the familiar profile page. Miller's profile picture showed him beaming, his arm around a young woman Michael didn't recognize. His recent posts were filled with pictures of a happy family, snapshots of everyday life that seemed a world away from the harsh realities they had once faced together. Michael hesitated for a moment, a pang of jealousy mixed with a genuine sense of happiness for his friend. He wondered if Miller would even remember him, if their bond had frayed with time and distance. He decided to send Miller a private message, keeping it brief and to the point. He introduced himself, reminding Miller of their shared time in their unit, and mentioned his return to Havenwood and the difficulties he was facing. He didn't go into detail about the bullying or the town's cold reception, simply hinting at his struggles and asking if Miller might be willing to connect. He sent the message with a knot of anxiety in his stomach, unsure of what kind of response to expect. He knew Miller had moved on, built a new life, a life that seemed so different from his own. Would he have time or inclination for a wounded comrade from a distant past? The days that followed were filled with anxious anticipation. Michael checked his messages constantly, his heart leaping with every notification, only to be met with disappointment time and again. Doubt began to creep back in, whispering insidious suggestions that he was foolish to think his old comrades would still care. Perhaps the bonds of war were only strong in the face of shared danger, fading into distant memories once the fighting stopped. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Corporal Miller. Michael's heart pounded as he opened it. The message was short and simple, but it was enough to reignite the flickering flame of hope within him. Mikey, holy cow, is that really you? So good to hear from you, brother. Been wondering what happened to you. Give me a call when you get a chance. Here's my number. A wave of relief washed over Michael, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. Miller remembered him. Miller cared. The connection hadn't been broken by time or distance. A genuine smile, the first in what felt like an eternity, spread across Michael's face. He wasn't alone after all. The sound of his phone ringing brought Michael out of his reverie. He glanced at the caller ID, and a familiar number flashed across the screen. It was Miller. He took a deep breath, a nervous flutter in his chest, and answered the call. Mikey, you old son of a gun, how the hell are you? Miller's voice boomed through the phone, the familiar enthusiastic tone instantly transporting Michael back to their days in the barracks. A genuine smile stretched across Michael's face. Miller time? I'm doing okay, man. Good to hear your voice. They talked for a long time that evening, catching up on the years that had passed since their last deployment. Miller shared stories about his wife, his kids, his civilian life. Michael, in turn, cautiously recounted his return to Havenwood and the difficulties he had been facing. He spoke of the isolation, the judgmental stares, the broken promises of a welcoming homecoming. Miller listened intently, his usual light-hearted tone replaced by a quiet concern. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply let Michael talk, offering occasional words of support and understanding. When Michael finally finished, his voice thick with emotion, Miller was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice firm and resolute. "That ain't right, Mikey. That ain't right at all. You went over there and put your life on the line for those people. The least they could do is show you some damn respect." Michael didn't know what to say. He had grown so accustomed to the indifference of Havenwood that Miller's immediate anger and unwavering support felt almost surreal. "Look, Mikey," Miller continued, his voice softening slightly. "I can't just sit here and listen to this. I gotta do something. How about I take some leave and come down there for a few days? We can catch up properly. Maybe even stir up a little bit of the old trouble, just like the good old days." The offer took Michael by surprise. He hadn't expected such a drastic gesture. "You don't have to do that, Miller," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You've got your family, your own life. Hell, Mikey, your family too. And besides," Miller added with a chuckle, "the wife says I need to get out of the house for a bit. Says I'm driving her crazy with my army stories. This will give me some new material." Michael laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that echoed through the quiet house. It felt good, the first real laugh he had had in months. "I'd like that, Miller. I really would." Arrangements were made quickly. Miller managed to secure a few days of leave, and within a week, he was stepping off the bus in Havenwood, a wide grin on his face and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked a little older, a little heavier, but the familiar spark in his eyes was still there. The reunion was everything Michael had hoped for and more. They spent hours talking, reminiscing about their time in service, sharing stories and laughter that filled Michael's house with a warmth he hadn't felt since before the war. Miller's presence was a balm to his wounded spirit, a reminder that he wasn't forgotten, that the bonds they had forged in the crucible of combat were still strong and true. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he wasn't alone. The first few days with Miller back in Havenwood were a whirlwind of shared memories, inside jokes, and the easy camaraderie that only comes from having faced life-threatening situations together. They spent hours recounting old missions, laughing at near misses, and honoring the memories of those they had lost. For Michael, it was like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Finally, he was with someone who understood. Someone who didn't judge him for his scars or treat him with pity, but amidst the laughter and reminiscing, Miller sensed a deeper pain in Michael, a lingering resentment and anger that went beyond the town's cold reception. One quiet evening, as they sat on the porch swing watching the fireflies blink in the twilight, Miller turned to Michael, his usual jovial expression replaced by a look of serious concern. "So, Mikey," Miller began, his voice soft, "you ain't just bummed about the town, are you? There's something else eating at you." Michael hesitated for a moment, staring out at the darkening sky. He had been hesitant to burden Miller with the full extent of his struggles, the humiliation of being bullied in his own hometown. But looking at his friend's earnest face, he knew he could trust him. He told Miller about Jake and his crew, about the taunts, the shoves, the disrespect towards his father's memory. He spoke of the burning rage that had briefly erupted in the cemetery, and the shame he felt afterwards. As he recounted these experiences, the raw anger resurfaced, his hands clenching into fists. Miller listened silently, his jaw tightening as Michael spoke. When Michael finally finished, his voice thick with bitterness, Miller let out a low whistle. "Those punks," Miller growled, shaking his head. "Messing with a brother like you. That ain't gonna fly." Michael sighed, a wave of weariness washing over him. "What can I do, Miller? I'm not the same guy I used to be. I can barely walk without this damn brace. I just wanted to come home and have some peace. But it's like they won't let me." Miller put a comforting hand on Michael's shoulder. "Listen to me, Mikey. You're stronger than you think. You faced down the Taliban. You faced down IEDs. A bunch of spoiled kids ain't nothing compared to that. But you don't have to face them alone." He paused, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, there were a few other guys in our unit who ended up back stateside. Remember Rodriguez? He got hit pretty bad too, lost part of his arm. Last I heard, he was living down in Texas. And Sergeant Major Davies, last I knew, he was running some kind of security consulting gig in DC. Michael nodded slowly, his mind racing. He hadn't thought about Rodriguez or Davies in a while. They had all gone their separate ways after the war, trying to rebuild their lives in their own ways. "Maybe," Miller said, a glint in his eye. "Maybe it's time to call in the old crew. We always had each other's backs over there. Why should it be any different here?" The idea, so bold and unexpected, hung in the air between them. A small spark of something other than despair flickered in Michael's chest. The thought of his old comrades, his brothers in arms, standing by his side, ready to face down the bullies of Havenwood, was both daunting and strangely exhilarating. Perhaps he wasn't as alone as he thought. Perhaps there was a way to find justice, not just for himself, but for the sacrifices they had all made. Miller didn't waste any time. The next morning, fueled by strong coffee and a shared sense of purpose, they began to formulate a plan. Miller, with his knack for logistics and his surprisingly adept skills at navigating the digital world, took the lead in tracking down their old unit members. Rodriguez, thankfully, was relatively easy to find through a veterans online forum. He responded to Miller's message with immediate enthusiasm, eager to reconnect with his old comrades. Sergeant Major Davies, however, proved to be a bit more elusive. His security consulting work took him all over the globe, and it took a few frantic phone calls and some skillful networking on Miller's part to finally track him down in Dubai. The conversation with Davies was brief but impactful. Miller laid out the situation in Havenwood, painting a picture of Michael's struggles and the disrespect he had endured. He didn't need to embellish. Davies, a man of unwavering loyalty and a deep sense of responsibility for the men under his command, immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. "Those civilian lowlifes messing with one of our own?" Davies' voice boomed over the crackling phone line, his Montana drawl thick with indignation. "Don't you worry, Corporal. I'll be there as soon as I can. Consider it a training exercise, with some particularly deserving targets." Michael, listening to Miller's end of the conversation, felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope mixed with a potent shot of adrenaline. The cavalry was coming. He wasn't alone in this fight. With Davies on his way, the focus shifted to planning their strategy. They knew they couldn't just go after Jake and his friends directly. They needed to make a statement, to send a message that would resonate throughout Havenwood. A message that would make everyone think twice before mistreating a returning veteran. Miller, ever the resourceful one, suggested a more subtle approach to start. They began by gathering information about Jake and his crew. Miller spent hours online, scouring social media profiles, local news archives, and even town gossip forums. They learned about Jake's part-time job at the local auto repair shop, his weekend hangouts at the dilapidated skate park, and his penchant for late-night drag races on the outskirts of town. They also gathered information about Billy and the other members of the group, piecing together a picture of their routines and weaknesses. As they compiled this information, Davies arrived in Havenwood, stepping off a late-night flight with a no-nonsense demeanor and a steely glint in his eye. His presence was immediately commanding, even in civilian clothes. He greeted Michael with a firm handshake and a gruff but heartfelt hug. "Good to see you back on your feet, Sergeant," Davies said, his voice rough with emotion. "Though I hear you've been having some trouble with the locals." "Don't worry, we're gonna fix that." With Davies now in town, the planning intensified. They spread out maps of Havenwood on Michael's kitchen table, marking key locations and outlining potential courses of action. Davies, with his years of tactical experience, took the lead, his mind sharp and focused despite the long flight. "We need to show them," Davies said, his finger tracing a route on the map, "that messing with one of us has consequences. Not just for them, but for anyone else who might think about it." Their plan began to take shape, a strategy that would utilize their unique skills and experience to send a clear and undeniable message to the bullies of Havenwood. A message delivered with the precision and impact of a well-executed military operation. The first phase of their plan focused on disrupting Jake's routine and sending him a clear, albeit non-lethal, warning. Miller, with his online sleuthing, had discovered Jake's penchant for late-night, illegal street racing on a deserted stretch of highway just outside of town. Davies, ever the strategist, saw this as an opportune moment to deliver their initial message. Under the cloak of darkness, Miller and Davies, with Michael acting as their local guide, made their way to the chosen section of highway. Davies, using some old contacts from his military police days, had managed to borrow a couple of unmarked vehicles that were more than capable of keeping up with any souped-up muscle car Jake might be driving. They parked a safe distance from the usual starting point of the races, their vehicles strategically positioned to block the highway if needed. Michael, though his legs still ached, felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. For the first time since returning home, he felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that he was actively doing something to reclaim his dignity. As expected, a few hours later, the rumble of high-performance engines echoed through the night. Several modified cars, driven by young men eager to prove their speed and recklessness, began to gather at the unofficial starting line. Among them was Jake's distinctive cherry-red Mustang, its loud exhaust announcing his arrival with an air of arrogant confidence. Davies watched the scene unfold with a grim satisfaction. "All right, boys," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "Let's show these knuckleheads what real horsepower looks like." As the racers revved their engines, preparing for their illegal sprint, Davies and Miller moved their vehicles into position, effectively blocking both ends of the highway. The sudden appearance of the unmarked cars, their occupants looking serious and determined, caused immediate confusion among the racers. Jake, behind the wheel of his Mustang, leaned out the window, yelling obscenities. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? Get out of the way!" Davies, his face illuminated by the headlights of the opposing cars, stepped out of his vehicle, his imposing figure commanding attention. He didn't need to shout. His mere presence radiated an authority that even the hot-headed racers couldn't ignore. "This highway is closed for unscheduled maintenance," Davies announced in a calm but firm voice that carried over the idling engines. "Anyone who attempts to race will be facing some serious consequences." The racers, initially defiant, began to realize that these weren't just some random civilians blocking their fun. There was something about Davies' demeanor, the way he carried himself, that suggested a level of authority they couldn't easily dismiss. Jake, however, wasn't one to back down easily. He revved his engine again, trying to intimidate Davies. "Get lost, old man. We were here first." Davies simply shook his head, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of military-grade night vision goggles, slipping them on before looking directly at Jake. "Son," Davies said, his voice now carrying a distinct edge, "I've seen things in the dark that would make your hair turn white. Trust me, you don't want to play this game." The combination of Davies' commanding presence and the unexpected appearance of the night vision goggles seemed to finally get through to Jake. His bravado faltered, and he slowly cut the engine of his Mustang. One by one, the other racers followed suit. Their illegal gathering effectively shut down without a single shot fired or a punch thrown. As the frustrated racers began to disperse, grumbling under their breaths, Davies turned to Michael and Miller, a satisfied look on his face. "Message sent," he said. "Phase 1 complete. Let's see if our boy Jake learned anything tonight." The quiet disruption of their illegal racing was just the opening salvo in their campaign to make the bullies of Havenwood pay for their torment. The disruption of the drag races was just the opening act. Davies, Miller, and Michael knew that to truly make an impact, they needed to target Jake and his friends on a more personal level, to disrupt their sense of normalcy and make them feel as vulnerable as Michael had felt. Miller's continued online reconnaissance revealed Jake's other passion, his meticulously maintained cherry-red Mustang. It was his pride and joy, the symbol of his perceived status in their small social circle. Davies, with a knowing glint in his eye, suggested that a little retuning of Jake's prized possession might send a message he couldn't ignore. Under the cover of a moonless night, Miller, using some lock-picking skills he had surprisingly picked up during his time in the service, gained access to Jake's garage. Davies, with Michael keeping watch, swiftly and silently went to work on the Mustang. They didn't damage the car irreparably, but they made a few subtle adjustments that would undoubtedly cause Jake significant frustration and expense. They loosened belts, subtly tampered with the engine timing, and even managed to replace the high-octane fuel with a lower-grade substitute. The goal wasn't to destroy the car, but to make it unreliable, to chip away at Jake's sense of control and invincibility. The following morning, Michael, with Miller and Davies observing from a distance, happened to be near the auto repair shop where Jake worked. As expected, Jake arrived in his Mustang, its engine sputtering and backfiring as he pulled into the parking lot. Jake's face was a mask of frustration and fury as he stormed into the shop, yelling at his co-workers about the sudden problems with his beloved car. The sight of Jake's distress brought a grim satisfaction to Michael, a small measure of payback for the torment he had endured. Their next target was Billy, the wiry member of Jake's crew who had been particularly vicious with his taunts. Miller's research had revealed Billy's part-time job, delivering pizzas for a local pizza parlor. Davies, ever the opportunist, saw this as another chance to deliver a subtle but effective message. One busy Friday night, Davies, using a burner phone and a disguised voice, placed a large order for pizzas to be delivered to a vacant address on the outskirts of town. An address conveniently located near a patch of particularly muddy and uneven terrain. Billy, being the unlucky delivery driver on duty, was dispatched with the order. As Billy's beat-up car navigated the dark and bumpy road to the fake address, Davies, again using his borrowed, unmarked vehicle, followed at a safe distance. When Billy arrived at the deserted location and realized it was a prank, Davies subtly used his vehicle to block Billy's car in the muddy area. Billy, panicking and trying to maneuver his car out of the mud, only managed to get it further stuck. Davies watched from a distance as Billy frantically tried to free his vehicle, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. After a significant delay, a mud-splattered and thoroughly defeated Billy finally managed to get his car unstuck and limped back to the pizza parlor, undoubtedly facing the wrath of his angry boss for the late and ruined pizzas. These initial actions were designed to be more annoying and disruptive than truly harmful. A way to send a clear message that Michael had allies who were watching and were not afraid to push back. They were subtle reminders that the balance of power in Havenwood might not be as straightforward as Jake and his crew had once believed. The game had changed, and Michael, with his newfound support, was no longer an easy target. The initial disruptions, while effective in causing annoyance, were just the prelude to a more impactful demonstration of their collective capabilities. Davies, Miller, and Michael knew that to truly deter Jake and his crew, they needed to hit them where it would hurt the most. Their sense of invincibility and the social standing they so desperately craved within their small community. Miller's continued online surveillance revealed that Jake was scheduled to participate in a local amateur boxing tournament, an event he had been bragging about for weeks on social media. Jake saw himself as the toughest guy in Havenwood, and this tournament was his opportunity to solidify that reputation. Davies, with a wry smile, suggested that perhaps Jake could use a little humbling before stepping into the ring. A few days before the tournament, Miller, again using his knack for online anonymity, started spreading rumors on local social media groups and forums. The rumors, subtly crafted and strategically placed, suggested that Jake had been exaggerating his boxing skills and had a history of ducking tougher opponents. The whispers, amplified by the small-town grapevine, began to sow seeds of doubt in the minds of Jake's potential opponents and even some of his friends. On the day of the tournament, as Jake confidently strutted into the local gymnasium, he was met with a noticeably cooler reception than he had anticipated. There were fewer cheers of encouragement, and he overheard snippets of conversations questioning his abilities. The rumors had clearly taken their toll, shaking his confidence and eroding his sense of dominance. Then, just before Jake's scheduled match, a figure entered the gymnasium, drawing the attention of everyone present. It was Rodriguez, who had arrived from Texas earlier that morning. His presence a silent but powerful statement. Rodriguez, despite the prosthetic arm he now wore with quiet dignity, still possessed the imposing physique of a seasoned soldier. He walked with a confident stride and positioned himself conspicuously near the boxing ring, his gaze fixed intently on Jake. The sight of Rodriguez, a visibly wounded veteran, watching him with such intensity, seemed to unnerve Jake further. The bravado he had displayed earlier began to crumble under the weight of Rodriguez's unwavering stare. In the ring, Jake fought tentatively, his usual aggression replaced by a hesitant and uncertain style. He ended up losing his match in a surprising and somewhat humiliating defeat, his reputation as the town's toughest guy taking a significant blow. The presence of Rodriguez at the boxing tournament, coupled with the rumors swirling around Jake's abilities, served as a powerful psychological blow. It was a clear message that Michael was not alone, that he had allies who were watching and were capable of influencing events in ways Jake and his crew couldn't comprehend. Their campaign of subtle but effective retribution continued with Billy. Miller discovered that Billy was deeply invested in his appearance and took great pride in his meticulously styled hair. Davies, with a mischievous grin, contacted a local barber shop and, using a fictitious name and credit card, booked a series of early morning appointments for Billy, spaced out just enough to disrupt his sleep schedule for the better part of a week. Billy, annoyed and increasingly sleep-deprived, became irritable and prone to lashing out, further damaging his already questionable social standing. These carefully orchestrated events, while seemingly minor on their own, collectively created an atmosphere of unease and a growing sense of paranoia among Jake and his friends. They started to realize that someone was watching them, someone who was capable of subtly manipulating their lives and undermining their sense of control. The feeling of being targeted, of being vulnerable, was a taste of the medicine they had so carelessly administered to Michael. The culmination of their efforts came during the town's annual Founders' Day parade, a typically cheerful and well-attended event that Jake and his friends usually reveled in. seeing it as another opportunity to showcase their youthful exuberance. This year, however, the atmosphere felt different for them, a subtle undercurrent of unease clinging to them like a persistent shadow. Miller, through some carefully worded inquiries among his local contacts, had discovered Jake's plan to participate in the parade. Driving his now temperamental Mustang, Davies, with a strategic smile, suggested that the parade offered the perfect opportunity for their final and most impactful message. As the parade began, the streets of Havenwood were lined with cheering spectators, waving flags and enjoying the festive atmosphere. Jake, behind the wheel of his sputtering Mustang, tried to project an air of confidence, but his forced smile didn't quite reach his nervous eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen forces were subtly manipulating the events around him. As Jake's Mustang slowly made its way down Main Street, it suddenly began to emit thick plumes of black smoke from its exhaust. The engine coughed and wheezed, losing power until it finally shuddered to a complete stop in the middle of the parade route, much to the amusement and annoyance of the surrounding crowd. Jake, his face flushed with embarrassment and frustration, frantically tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. His prized Mustang, once a symbol of his status, had become a public spectacle of failure. Then, just as Jake was about to lose his temper completely, a different vehicle approached, its presence unmistakable. It was an olive-green military Humvee, driven by Miller, with Davies sitting in the passenger seat and Michael sitting in the back. The sight of the Humvee, so out of place amidst the festive floats and marching bands, caused a stir among the onlookers. Miller stopped the Humvee directly in front of Jake's stalled Mustang. Davies stepped out of the vehicle, his gaze fixed on Jake with an air of quiet authority. He didn't say a word, but his presence, the military vehicle, and the knowing looks exchanged with Michael sent a clear and undeniable message to Jake and everyone watching. Michael had powerful allies who were not to be trifled with. Jake's bravado finally crumbled. He looked from Davies to Michael, the fear in his eyes palpable. He understood, without a single word being spoken, that their torment of Michael had not gone unnoticed and had serious consequences. The public humiliation, the string of unfortunate events, and the undeniable presence of military might were more than enough to convey the message. Michael, watching from the back of the Humvee, felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. But it was tinged with a weariness that came from the realization that revenge, while momentarily gratifying, wasn't the ultimate answer. He saw the fear in Jake's eyes, the shame, and he knew that a line had been crossed. Davies simply nodded curtly at Jake before getting back into the Humvee. Miller slowly drove around the stalled Mustang, and as they passed, Michael met Jake's gaze. There was no triumph in Michael's eyes, only a quiet understanding. The score had been settled, but at what cost? Havenwood returned to its normal rhythm after the parade, but the events of the past few weeks had left an undeniable mark. Jake and his crew, humbled and perhaps a little wiser, kept a respectful distance from Michael. The whispers in town shifted from those of pity and judgment to those of speculation and a grudging respect for the quiet veteran who had unexpectedly revealed hidden depths. Michael, with the support of his loyal comrades, had faced his tormentors and emerged not with a thirst for further vengeance, but with a renewed sense of self-respect and a quiet understanding of the unexpected power of loyalty and the enduring bonds of brotherhood. The haven he had returned to was still flawed, but it was a place where he could finally begin to heal, knowing that he wasn't alone and that sometimes the most formidable strength comes in the quietest of forms.